As everyone gets seated, we'll get started today for the welfare debate. I'll try to be brief here. We have Sinclair Davidson will be giving the first part, and then Senator David Leyonhjelm will be the second. It'll be 20 minutes each, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So please get on the WOVA app and submit your questions there. And to start off, Sinclair Davidson. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to be at the Friedman conference and meet with all my friends. So thank you for coming, and thank you for sticking around on Sunday afternoon. Now, one of the challenges with having a debate with David is actually finding something that you disagree with. I think after I was in New York 2 weeks ago when I discovered I was doing this because David was phoning me at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, Sinclair, what are we going to talk about? So I think we've identified the issue where David is completely wrong. And I'm always happy for David to be wrong because that means he's going to learn something. So... Where are we? The general principle, I mean, how do we think about the welfare state? How do we design a good welfare system? And as the Irish wit once said, I wouldn't be starting from here. And unfortunately, this is where we are starting from, and there are some complex issues and problems that we have to deal with. And the problems and issues we have to deal with are the constraints. Now, the very first constraint is that even though economists generally and libertarians especially always make the assumption that people know their own best interests and act in their own best interests all the time, we do know that this is an assumption, and we do know that there are people out there who make systematic errors, continually making bad choices, and from time to time we need to do something about this, and we can argue what we do about it or not. But a classic case, for example, would be anti-vaxxers. David voted for legislation to persecute these people and force them to vaccinate their children. And so the market for paternalism is not an empty set. Okay, so that's the first constraint. So there are some people sometimes that we need to assist. The second problem, of course, is opportunism, the bad back problem. And for those of you who came to the blockchain talk, you would have heard that blockchain is a mechanism of dealing with opportunism on many other respects. But we have a problem with the welfare system whereby people will opportunistically take advantage of our good nature of us trying to help people. So those are the first two constraints that we have to worry about. And then the third constraint that I think a lot of people don't think about too often is promises have been made, and promises have to be honored. And that is going to touch on the one issue where I think David and I do actually disagree substantially. So let's get into the basic principles. And the basic principles, of course, is what government can do, what government should do, and what government does do. And we can all agree that government does far too much in Australia, around the world generally speaking, but our constitution fails to restrain governments. If you have a look at a lot of our political institutions, they are about how we make collective decisions, how votes are allocated, how government is formed. We actually have very few institutions which actually determine how government should spend money. And what they can and can't spend money on. So we actually need to have a fiscal constitution as well as a political constitution, and that's an argument which the late James Buchanan was made quite forcibly. So what does government do? And government does far too much, and we can agree on this point. So I'm a big fan of 2x2 matrices, and there it is. We have a public good, and we have the use of coercion in the economy, and government does coercion and public goods. And so where there is an actual public good, a random example, national security, and that should be paid for by the income tax, and we should force people to pay tax for that purpose. Okay, all good. If it is a genuine public good and we don't coerce people, we have a free rider problem. A lot of people get very hung up on free rider problems. I have to say a free rider doesn't worry me too much, but nonetheless it is a problem, and we might have in a system too little national security, for example, if we weren't forcing people to pay for it. Where there's no public good and no coercion, that's the private economy. We're all very happy and we understand that particular problem. The fourth box is the disputed territory. What happens where we don't have a public good and yet the government forces us to pay for it or forces us to consume it or somehow coerces us? Now, this is a disputed territory, and in the modern economy, that disputed territory is massive. If we think that the federal government is probably spending up to about, say, 30-40% of GDP, I would take away everything that isn't national security and say, well, that's in the disputed territory. There's no reason why the government should have an ABC, and there was an excellent book published just on the weekend, so please be sure to get your copies. There's no reason why we should have a public health system. There is no reason why the federal government should have an education system, so on and so forth. So that disputed territory is, of course, quite massive. So we can agree on that, but we can't even agree that the disputed territory is a problem. So here are some sensible people. Hayek says there's no automatic presumption against government in the disputed area. The communist. Mises at least gets this right. He says, well, anything that the government does beyond the protection of life, health, liberty, and private property is an evil. Okay. Health. What a Bolshevik. James Buchanan. Some extensions of state power are more legitimate than others. Duh. So the problem is that sensible people who we would normally quote and like and what have you, even in this space, there is controversy as to what government can and can't and shouldn't be doing. Overgovernment, however, is a problem for democracy, and certainly I'm of the view that overgovernment is one of the reasons why people are getting angry and dissatisfied, and we have all this hostility towards democracy, because we do actually end up voting to spend other people's money on ourselves. And Arthur Sheldon basically made this argument, is that in the end, the government ends up waging financial guerrilla warfare against its own citizens. And that is the modern welfare state, and that's what it does. So we very quickly disagree on all sorts of things as to what can and should be done. Now, I just want to have a formalish model. This is a model which we make use of at RMIT quite a lot. It was first derived by Andrei Schleifer of Harvard University and a few of his co-authors, where we model the trade-offs in society of getting things done. And on the y-axis, we have private disorder, and on the x-axis, we have public disorder, or dictatorship, as we might call it. And so we just track out the various costs of doing things. So up on the top quadrant, does this have a laser thingy? Anyway, it doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter. Up on the top, we have private charity. So we might say that the welfare system should consist only of private charity. Now, we libertarians would love that idea, and we probably advocate that idea, but there are going to be costs associated with that, because charities would then deal with the cute and cuddly blue eyes and the animals with, like, and all this sort of stuff, and the unfashionable causes would probably get no money. So if we have a look in terms of animal welfare, for example, there's always people giving money to save elephants and rhinos. Nobody ever gives money to save African dogs. Okay, the wild dogs of Africa, because they are ugly, mangy creatures. Okay, they are actually facing extinction. Okay, nobody gives money to those things because nobody likes them. They are very ugly. So what we do is we say, well, okay, we can't just sort of give money to who can tug on the heartstrings. Everybody's got to have a fair go, the African dogs. And so we go to a public welfare system. But the public welfare system has got very high dictatorship costs. There's the coercion associated with it, supporting causes you don't want to support, the ABC, for example, and so on and so forth. So there are good and bad characteristics of a private charity model and a full-blown government model. There was some talk in the earlier session about superannuation. Now, superannuation is a terrible system because it's coercive, it makes people save their own money, and so on and so forth. But there is one good argument for superannuation, and that one good argument was that there'd be less coercion of individuals in future because the government wouldn't collude with people who hadn't saved for their own futures to steal your money. That was the good argument, and I've made that argument at previous Friedman conferences. Unfortunately, Kelly O'Dwyer has destroyed that argument. She's now just stealing our money anyway. So even though we have a privatized public age system, aged care system, it was privatized, the government are still more or less now taxing it to death and stealing the money. So I think the arguments for super have actually kind of deteriorated. But when we deal with the welfare system, we get into the politics of envy. Somebody out there who is undeserving is getting something that you are not getting. And I made a whole long list of these undeserving people. So we have poor versus rich, low income, high income, cash poor, asset rich, uneducated, educated, unemployed, not-for-profit versus profit, privileged versus unprivileged, everybody against white males, refugees against citizens, old versus young. At every single one of those points, there is conflict in a welfare system at some margin at some time. So there they all are. And then that brings us to where David and I think we think we disagree on this point. Welfare for millionaires. Okay, now there are various types of millionaires out there. Do we want millionaires receiving welfare? And of course we're appalled and horrified and shocked, and it's totally immoral. And the arguments, or where the arguments have been made over the last while, revolve around negative gearing, revolve around franking credits, revolve around business deductions. Now, those first three are examples of fiscal illusion. There are perfectly good, acceptable, rational reasons why we have negative gearing, franking credits, and business deductions. And what we have are activists deliberately sowing trouble, making political gains out of the fact that most people simply don't understand how the tax system works. The last one. Asset test for the age pension. The exclusion of the family home from the asset test for the age pension means that we have Nana living in a $1 million house receiving the age pension, and how appalling is that? Okay. That actually is a very sophisticated ruse to expropriate property from elderly Australians. Now, you might not think that you are engaged in a ruse to expropriate property, but that's what you actually do. Oh, definitely, that's what you want to be doing. Okay. So, first thing, it's not actually true. The family home is not excluded from the asset test. If you go and have a look at how the system actually works, there are two categories of age pension recipient. One's called a homeowner, and the other one's called a non-homeowner. And what happens is that the asset test kicks in at different levels for homeowners and non-homeowners. So what is happening here is that the governments are not going out and valuing your home. They are saying the housing services which you receive from your home is $203,000. And now remember, a home is like any other good or service. It is a bundle of characteristics. So what happens is the government is saying we are deeming the value of your house to be worth $203,000, or the value of the housing services which you own are worth $203,000. The rest of your house is yours. Okay, now we can quibble. Maybe it should be $300,000, $400,000, $50,000. Pick a number and slot it in. But the number is actually in there. So, the full value of the family home is not included. Do we trust the government to value your house? I know we do it at all sorts of other margins for property taxes and all that sort of stuff, but I don't trust the government at all. Reasons why it should be a fixed number and not a variable number is, first of all, your housing stock is illiquid. Houses are not fungible. That can't be fractionalized just yet. In a blockchain-enabled world, we will be able to fractionalize the value of the housing stock, but we can't do that just yet. I know people who are selling products to work on this. The ICO was a few weeks ago. What are we going to do with these elderly people? Bearing in mind, when you move somebody out of their own home, which might be quite rickety as it currently stands, and you move them into another home, you have to start thinking about medical facilities. You have to worry about social dislocation. However, when you make these sorts of arguments, you often hear, yeah, that's all very well and good, but Nana could sell her house, but instead she's going to live in the house and leave it to her unworthy, undeserving children. To which point I always say, well, if you were nice to your grandmother, she would leave you a nice house too. But we have an inefficient death problem. The efficient way to die is that your bank account and your body and your brain give up at the same time. Okay? That doesn't happen for most people. For most people, either your body or your bank account gives out first. People have a rational fear that their bank account will give out before their body does. And you have people at Treasury and the Reserve Bank saying people are over investing in their aged care because they're worried they're going to outlive their money. Well, that is actually a real threat and a real problem that people should worry about. What should we do with the elderly? Well, I'm going to say we should actually honor the promises that were made. People were promised, they were actually promised that if they paid their social security contributions, they would be looked after in old age. There was a promise made during the Second World War because the government needed money, and they made a promise, and they have very slowly over time been rolling back on the mechanisms to remind people that the promises were actually made. Or we could renege. And then politicians worry about why we loathe them so much. Or we could go for involuntary euthanasia, the Logan Run problem. Now, just bearing in mind we're going to have voluntary euthanasia soon, which means after that it'll become compulsory. But what are we going to do? What about housing affordability? I think the first thing we have to say to ourselves is stop pretending that the elderly are hoarding the housing stock. Okay. It's not the case that you can't buy a nice house because somebody else is living in it. It is actually their house. Stop trying to raise taxes. If you want to have a bigger housing stock, deregulate the housing approval process and deregulate housing costs. Also abolish things like first homeowners grants and all these sorts of things. And if you want to buy a house and you are a young person, get a second job. Eat less smashed avocado. Move out to the sticks. Sponge off your parents. I mean, these are all mechanisms that everybody else has ever used, and you too can do that. And I'm 3 minutes under time. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Sinclair. Next up, Senator David Leyonhjelm.
Well, I'm going to explain to you in a few moments why what you just heard was the Manchurian candidate, the communist infiltrator, the left-wing sneaky bastard who has outward signs of libertarianism but is irredeemably lost to the communist cause. So I'm used to dealing in the Senate, and we're not allowed to have props, so there'll be nothing to look at. But I am surrounded by lefties and people who want to spend other people's money in the Senate, and I sit just across the aisle from the Greens too. So every now and then I need to be able to tune out. So I dream a little bit. And in that dream, I dream that the Liberal Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and if push comes to shove, the state governments as well. Although on welfare, primarily, it's a federal matter. And that allows me to dream, should there be any government welfare at all. We libertarians believe strongly in private charity, philanthropy, mutual organisations, non-profit organisations, families, neighbourhoods and villages. So if there was no private charity, no public charity, no public welfare, would those private sources be sufficient? Would it be enough to prevent old people starving to death or the disabled unable to get help? It's an interesting conversation to have. What we do know is government charity discourages private charity. You know that when somebody asks you for a charitable donation, you run through your mind, why are you asking me for money, you bastards? You're already getting it from me via my taxes. We all do it, I think. We sometimes give it anyway, but we probably give less than we would otherwise give if we didn't know that they were already getting it from someone. So what we need to think about is, if there was no government welfare in this dream, would it be a cruel, heartless society? Now, we know that in the time of Charles Dickens, there was no government charity, no government welfare. And we know that people did suffer, people did die, they did miss out. But also, if you heard Peter Phelps yesterday, Peter is probably the most educated libertarian politician in the country, as far as I can tell. He says that at the time of federation in Australia, 85% of working class people were involved in a health mutual, which covered their health costs. So 85% is pretty good. So it's possible that we're a compassionate society. We have moved on from the time of Charles Dickens. It's quite possible that if we relied primarily on private charity, then public government-funded welfare might only need to deal with something like 15% of those who need it. Which then brings me to the question, and I wake up from my dream and I think, who actually does need it? Age pensions in this country cost $50 billion a year. Disability support pensions cost $20 billion. Family tax benefits cost almost $20 billion. Childcare subsidies are available for people who are earning up to $350,000 a year, and it would have been more than that. It would have been unlimited, uncapped, if it hadn't been for me being a bastard and blackmailing the government. You can still receive a disability support pension even if your parents are the richest people in Australia and you are receiving the specialised services under the NDIS. You can be eligible for family tax benefit A up to an income of $217,000. Billions are going to people who are not poor and not needy. And there's a sense of entitlement. If other people are getting it, why not me? My wife and I travel quite a lot. I'm determined not to allow this Senate job to ruin my opportunities to see the world, bits of the world I haven't seen. I am forever encountering people who are spending up big so that they can go home and qualify for the pension. It is happening all the time. There are financial advisors and accountants who specialise in telling you how to structure your affairs so you can qualify for mostly the pension. It is an industry these days. So if we start from the fact that I'm now awake and my dream is over, how could we restructure the current welfare system so that we end this mentality, this attitude of entitlement? I profoundly disagree with our communist friend here that there was ever an understanding that you would be looked after in your old age if you just simply paid your taxes. In New Zealand, they have what they laughingly call a superannuation system, where they take some of your taxes and they say that's for your old age, that's to pay for your pension. In the UK, they have an accumulation system run by the government, and you pay into it a proportion of your salary, and you receive benefits back in the form of a pension in proportion to how much you've paid. And if you haven't put much in, you don't get very much out. We've never had that in this country. Politicians have made promises, but if you're naive enough to believe that politicians' promises should be binding, especially if they were made back in World War II, then you're probably a South African academic who wasn't even in Australia at that period and didn't come till a great deal later. So I would discount all of that. I would say, let's not pretend what might have been, what a politician once said. We have never in this country had an understanding that you don't have to save for your old age. You do have to save for your old age. It has always been the case that you have had to save for your old age, and only if you didn't save enough for your old age to reach whatever we agreed is a certain living standard, a certain level of dignity, do you then hold your hand out to receive other people's money. So how could that be improved? First of all, we don't really make the most of our superannuation scheme. It's, if you heard the previous session with Andrew Bragg in here, it's rorted by the unions and to some extent the employer groups, their clubs. It's a bit of an industrial relations club for the industry funds. They help themselves to that money with quite high fees. A lot of it leaks into the unions, ends up going to the ALP as well. That money is members' money. That money could be used to help fund their retirement. That's their contributions that's being diverted. We really need to end that. It's also that there are issues. Adam Crichton has written about this quite extensively. They do suffer from a lack of competition. They don't compete with each other enough, the super funds, for your business. But at the same time, we also, to some extent, make it hard for them to compete with each other because we say, well, you have to maintain a fairly high degree of liquidity. So as a result, they don't go and do what the Canadian pension funds do, for example, and buy up Australian farms and long-term assets, which they know will be good for their members, for their pension recipients over the next 30 or 40 years. We also need to think about the tax structure of superannuation. Why do we tax the money going in? What's the point of that? Don't we want people to save for their retirement? We should not be taxing it on the way in. We shouldn't be taxing it when it's in the fund either. We should let it accumulate tax-free. And then when you retire and when you need that money, but you might just be semi-retiring and you want to take some of it out, it should come out at the normal tax rates, whatever those are. Now, if it was a Liberal Democrats government and we resumed in my dream, that would be a fairly low tax rate. But still, you would be paying income tax on it. I would also contemplate whether or not, because this is diverting money into a tax-free environment, away from the taxed environment, that has an impact on revenue. Even at low tax rates, it would have an impact on revenue. So you might put a cap on it. At the moment, that cap is $1.6 million per person. I think that's way too low. You need something to aspire to. So I'd bring it up to maybe 5 or 10 million, but you'd put a cap on it. And you would also probably put some sort of limits, I'm not exactly sure of the details here, on how much you could withdraw as a lump sum. What we have now is people taking money out of their super fund in lump sums, spending it on renovating their house and then saying, now give me a pension. Now I'm eligible for a pension. I think there's an argument. I'm not real fond of compulsory saving, but on the scheme of things, from cigarettes, taxes on cigarettes to various other things in the coercive scale, forced saving for your retirement is not such an offensive thing. And you probably could argue for a lower rate of contributions to super for youngsters, maybe 18 to 30 or under 30, perhaps a slightly higher rate than what we're currently paying for those up to 40, and then from 40 onwards you've got to make a pretty serious contribution. Now, to get on to this area that Sinclair raised about eligibility, including the family home, we have people who genuinely have multi-million-dollar houses eligible for the pension. Now, you can argue it from Sinclair's point of view and say, oh, they were given undertakings. Well, I don't think they were. Or you can say, well, it'd be disruptive to force them to move out. But nobody would force them. They would just be less eligible for the pension. That's all you would be doing. So they would have choices. We're not talking about children here. We're talking about grown-up adult people in their retirement making a decision about their own finances. This is not nanny state stuff. They're capable of making a choice. Do you want to continue living in that house? Do you want to free up some of the liquidity in your house or some of the value of your house via reverse mortgage or even the new system that the government has introduced in the budget? Do you want to sell and move? No one's forcing you to sell and move. It's up to you. But we have people who are receiving the pension, living in very, very valuable houses in many instances, and that pension is being paid for by people who are working, paying taxes and can't afford to buy a house at all, who are renting. I cannot see how that can be equitable. If you haven't saved up enough for your retirement, or you've put it all into your house, or put it the other way, if your big asset is your house, you have saved enough for your retirement. That is an asset in your retirement. And if after all your house and your other assets, you still don't have enough for retirement, that's a sign you haven't saved up enough during your life. That happens. But it's not a badge of honour. It's not an entitlement. It's not an entitlement to say, I can hold out my hand for other people's money. It should not be something that you are proud of. It should be something slightly embarrassing. I have to receive other people's money because I didn't save up enough during my working life. Now, some people will say, well, life handed me a shit sandwich and I couldn't do that. Okay, that happens, so we can accept that. But there is no, I don't think there's any right to say I paid taxes all my life and I am entitled to a pension. Harry Triggerboff and Gina Reinhardt pay a lot of taxes too, much more than most of us. And I think you would all agree that we shouldn't be handing out a pension to them. If we're going to draw the line somewhere, then we've got to draw the line, I think, at an equitable level. Now, I hope I've revealed to you the secret communist that I am debating against here today. A couple of other aspects he said that confirm that. He said people make bad choices and we have to do something about that. I think choices are something us libertarians think we should be able to make for ourselves. And he also accused me of forcing people to have vaccinations. No. All I favour is if you want to hold your hand out for government money, and in this case it's childcare subsidy, then you have to have your brats vaccinated. And in terms of unfashionable causes, nobody gives money. And he raised the example of the African dogs. He's not only is he a communist, he's an evil communist. Ugly people on welfare are shouldn't be regarded as the African dogs of welfare. Thank you very much.